Right, good morning everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of Elevenses. It's Sunday, the 7th of June. Just before I go any further, just one reminder, don't forget that from this week we'll be down to two editions of Elevenses per week on Wednesdays and Sundays. I'm cutting it down basically because a lot of people are back to work, and looking at the viewing figures and getting feedback from people who are watching it too. A lot of people seem to be watching it on catch up rather than live, so it makes sense in some ways to reduce the number of shows. It's a fairly dramatic commitment for me in terms of time. Actually, it usually takes me a couple of hours to put one of these 30-minute shows together. So as I'm getting back to work, don't forget then it'll be Wednesdays and Sundays at 11 from now on. The catch-up show will still be available, of course, whenever you want to watch it, and that'll be here on Facebook. It'll also be on YouTube, so plenty of opportunity to spot the show if you don't get here live. Right, it's a bit of a rush job getting it all ready this morning, I have to admit. So still in a bit of a muddle as to what I was going to talk about, but what we've got, Turkish tyre brand is coming to the UK. Whether you want to put Turkish tyres on the bike, I don't know, but I'll tell you a little bit about them. I will be looking at MotoGP and the Isle of Man TT races, which have both been cancelled, but you can both catch up with some virtual entertainment there. We'll be talking about how the driving tests situation is panning out, and the answer to that is a complete muddle. I will also be asking questions about motorcycle parking and how you can actually use the motorcycle and stay COVID-19 safe at the same time. So plenty still to come on the show, so stay with us to the end. Just a reminder, you are watching Elevenses with Kevin Williams of Survival Skills Rider Training. Right, okay, so first bit of news, fairly horrific shooting on Wednesday. That's happened not very far away from where I live, actually, up here in northwest London. A gunman opened fire on a car, apparently aiming at two teenagers, but also hit a woman, a mother of a 2-year-old, and the 2-year-old child. The child is apparently seriously ill in hospital, but in a stable condition. The other three passengers, the 2 teenagers and the woman, were not badly hurt apparently. But what kind of frustrates me about these stories is that they always headline with biker and motorcyclist. No, it wasn't a biker or a motorcyclist, it was a gunman who happened to be using a motorcycle as a means of transport. No one would actually say car driver involved in shooting, would they? And it really does bug me that an incident like this, it kind of pops up as a sort of motorcycle related event. That's why it appears on my news feed. We kind of wish the people involved a speedy recovery, particularly the young child, clearly blameless in the incident. Obviously we hope the gunman's caught, but please don't use this as a sort of a way of saying motorcycling or biking had anything to do with it. It didn't. It was simply a gunman using two-wheeled transport. Okay, that was my little rant out of the way. There's remarkable lack of news around us today, apart from that story. But one bit that did catch my eye, there's a UK importer called Cambrian Tyres, and I've noticed them in the past because they do seem to get themselves involved in bringing in some unusual brands. Now, motorcyclists go with fads on when it comes to tyres. The interesting thing is, of course, that when I kind of first got involved in motorcycles, a lot of bikes were fitted with Bridgestone tyres out of the box, and virtually the first thing you did with a Bridgestone tyre was throw it straight in the bin and fit something else. We'd go for Avons or Dunlops, or at a pinch something like a Metzler. The weird thing is that tyres go through sort of progressions of attractiveness, and Bridgestone have managed to gain themselves quite a dedicated following in the UK from people who say now that they would never use anything else. Now, and then they'll look at something like a Turkish brand and say, wouldn't touch it with a barge pole. Well, of course, if you've not used it, how the hell do you know? So anyway, let's just talk about the brand is called Anlas, and they've brought in the Viento Sport tyre, and it's called a Hyper Sport tyre, and basically what they're saying is it offers high levels of performance on track and road, and it's aimed at riders of super sports, super bikes, and the hyper naked motorcycles. So what's its construction like? Well, it says it's got variable winding technology, which it says sees the tension of the carcass alter across the profile of the tyre, allowing them to optimize the contact patch at all angles of lean, which gives better handling and better traction. And they use a high silica compound in combination with eye-catching tread patterns, which they say offers excellent warm-up times from cold and all-weather grip for reassurance on wet and dry roads. Well, that's an interesting sort of a bunch of statements there, because there's a bit of a mix and match. First thing is that this variable tread profile contact patch technology isn't new. Continental were offering this on tyres at least a decade ago, and Continental, interestingly, are another brand that a lot of people won't have anything to do with, and I've absolutely no idea why, because I use them on my bikes. I use them for work. They also get a bit of a hammering on the track when I do the track sessions down at Brands Hatch when I'm working on the ride skills courses down there. And whilst they don't hold up particularly well when the track is really warm, midsummer when the sun's beating down on it and track temperature is quite high, the tyre overheats. But for normal track use, and I would put myself as sort of mediumly brisk. I wouldn't say I'm sort of particularly a track day nutter, but I'm reasonably quick around the track. I don't get overtaken by that many people in our groups. The tyre holds out remarkably well. Yeah, it balls up a bit on the edge, but the only time I've actually had any serious problem with those Contis is, as I say, when the air temperature has been very high already and we've been in midsummer under a cloudless sky. When the track temperature gets hot, then they do go off. They're not good enough for that, but on the road they work wet, dry, summer, winter. They are fantastic tyres. So will these Anlas tyres be any better? Good question. Hard to say until you've actually tried them. One doesn't know. Due to a tyre crisis one day a few years ago, I bought a budget tyre. I won't tell you the make of it. I did actually write a report of this on the website a few years ago, but I bought a budget tyre and it turned out to be a mistake. Not only did it wear extremely fast, it was just on 1,000 miles of use when I threw it away, but the carcass also split badly. There were huge cracks developing in the thing, and it looked very much like the tyre was about to delaminate. And as this was in use on a 600 Hornet, it was hardly ripping the tarmac up onto the throttle. And I wasn't using it particularly fiercely either. I never got near the track, and I'm very glad it didn't. So it doesn't mean that these tyres are bad at all, just because they're unknown. But keep an eye on reviews and things and see what people have to say. But basically, try to avoid the kind of reviews where the journalists in particular are pretty grim at this. They will only talk about things that they really seem to know about. So I'm kind of keep an eye on it. They've got 120 fronts, 120/70 fronts, 180 and 190 17-inch rears, and it says they're going to be bringing in a 160 profile rear as well at some point later. So, okay, I'll be talking about driving tests in a minute and what's going on there. I've also given you a link to a video which I think is well worth watching for many different reasons. It's a three-pronged video, but it's actually well worth a view. I'll talk about that again in just a minute. I'll be talking about driving tests and what's going on there, and we'll be looking at bike parking and bike sanitizing as well later on during the show. Don't forget, if you have a comment, a question, any feedback at all, suggestions for something you'd like me to cover on a new show, do drop me a line. I get remarkably few of the last ones, even though I keep asking for them. So, don't be shy. If you want me to talk about anything, I'm more than happy to try. Now, on the tyre issue, before I move on to the next section, one of the interesting points on that video that I've linked to, the Fortnite video, they talked about original fitment tyres and how those tyres are a bit of a cheat sometimes. Now, I actually noticed this myself some years ago. I bought a 200-mile-old XJ6 diversion, and it came with some Dunlop tyres on it, which had been getting rave reviews in the press. Now, I have to admit that when I rode the bike, the test ride on those Dunlops, the bike handled nicely. The bike could have come on Bridgestones, and I'd also tried one on Bridgestones, and it really didn't handle very well on those tyres. They didn't seem to suit the bike's characteristics at all, but the Dunlops worked really nicely. Now, they were supposed to be a dual compound sport tyre, a sport touring tyre, I should say. So I was hoping for some reasonable mileage out of them. In fact, within a couple of thousand miles, it was very obvious that the rear had squared off badly and that the tyre wasn't actually going to last any time at all. In fact, it got to just over 4,000 miles. The rear tyre was virtually out of tread by that point, and so they went in the bin, and my favourite Contis went on, which actually improved the handling of the bike over the Dunlops, in my opinion. But it's always a bit difficult to tell when you're taking a really knackered old tyre off and putting a brand new one on. Everything feels better with a new tyre. But anyway, I was disappointed with the performance of those tyres. I just happened to go to the NEC that particular autumn. And while I was up there, the Dunlop stand was out there, and they happened to have one of their tyre technicians on the stand. And so I toddled over to him and I said, "What about these tyres on this XJ6 then?" I told him the problems with them and that I wasn't very happy about them. And he got a bit shifty and evasive, quite frankly. And anyway, after a bit of prodding and the fact that I mentioned that I was running a training school, and I dropped a few subtle hints that the bikes might be XJ6s and they might just have Dunlops on, and a few things like that. And I got a bit of an admission out of him. What he actually ended up by admitting off the record was that the OE fitment Dunlop on the XJ6 wasn't the same as the aftermarket tyre. And in fact, the key point that I had noticed, the high wear rate in the middle of the tyre, which flatted it, was because the OE tyre was actually a single compound rubber. So I suspect what you got on that tyre was the soft rubber all the way around the tyre, which is why it wore out badly in the middle. It's an interesting reason for doing that. Now, if you watch the video link that I provided you, you'll find the presenter talking about this and how, in fact, the OE tyres don't even have much tread on them when they arrive from the factory in some cases, because basically it makes the tyre lighter, quicker to warm up, grippier, and cheaper to fit to the motorcycle. So what you get new isn't what you're going to get from an aftermarket tyre. And anyway, the experience with that Dunlop, I didn't go back to them. I have to admit, they cost them a potential sale, because I tend to go for tyres which are fitted to bikes if I like them, simply because I know they work. But anyway, they avoided them and went back to my usual Contis. But yeah, have a watch of that video, because it does make some interesting reading. Okay, so don't forget, you're watching Elevenses with Kevin Williams. My books are now available to purchase again. The website has been fixed. You can see everything. You can order everything. So if you're still not riding, you can read, and that will be a good place to start with some of my books. What else have we got for you? I'm going to be talking about driving tests. I'm going to be talking about safe use of a motorcycle if you are commuting, and a problem nobody seems to have thought about, which is where we're all going to park. So now, what else? Isle of Man TT. I've given you a link for that already. If you're missing your biking fix, you'd know that the Isle of Man TT would be kicking off in June. And it's obviously not happening this year, thanks to COVID-19. But the local race organisers over there are putting together a schedule of events to sort of follow the TT pattern, interviews with the riders, highlights from some of the past races, and all that kind of thing. They're calling it the TT lock-in. So if you follow the link which I've given you, you will be taken to that site and you can get some TT fix if you're missing it. I certainly always make a point of watching the TT on ITV4 when it's on, and I've made some trips over there in the past because I have to say I do enjoy watching the event. So I will miss it this year. I will try and catch some of the lock-in schedule. The other thing to keep an eye open for later today, I think it's on at 2 o'clock European time. So I think that's I'm not quite sure what time that is UK. Maybe it's 3 o'clock European, 2 o'clock UK. Anyway, do check. But MotoGP from Silverstone is on in virtual format. That is, it would be the weekend of the race here, but due to its cancellation, they are running it on the Isle of Man on the MotoGP race game, and I've watched a few of those already, and I have to say they are pretty good fun. The racing is best described as elbow to elbow. Fortunately, with the ability to pick themselves up and dust themselves down very quickly and get back on the bike, unlike the real life. But it's remarkably how good some of those riders actually are on a virtual track using a PlayStation style controller. Amazes me because I can never keep the thing on the track beyond the first corner. Right, okay, so what's been going on with the driving tests? Well, I'm a member of the DIA, the Driving Instructors Association, and I've been kind of a little bit disappointed with the feedback from the DIA about what's going on. But, they've just issued a letter which said they've spoken this week, as usual, to the DVSA, and they've impressed upon them again the need for further guidance and communication on the resumption of testing and training. Now, the DIA are mostly concerned with car drivers, but they do obviously cover motorcycle trainers as well. So they do have our interests at heart. But the problem is that what they found is that the DVSA aren't, in fact, completely responsible for the bottleneck. And what they said in their letter was that in our conversations yesterday, I think this email arrived in my email box on Friday, the agency appraised us of the many hurdles they need to jump over to open up testing again, and the core issue they face of not being able to make any decision as the agency alone about restarting testing. This is the DVSA that when they say agency. And so the DVSA are therefore dependent on central government approval to resume testing at any level. Now, the DIA have now asked the CEO of the DVSA, who's Gareth Llewellyn, to communicate the challenges that the DVSA face and the steps that they need to take directly to the trainers so that we can all understand why it is that we can't get a firm date out of the DVSA. There have been rumours from an article in the Telegraph that tests would resume in July, and it seems that theory test bookings at least were being taken for June, but it looks like those are being cancelled as they sort of come towards the date at which they should happen. The DIA point out that there has been no direct communication from DVSA since the 22nd of April, and considering we're now into June, and that means that driver trainers and rider trainers are sitting there waiting to hear what's going on, that's pretty damned appalling. And Mr. Llewellyn has said that he is seeking approval from the DFT to share more information, and so that the industry has a better understanding of the challenges. It seems very unlikely that tests will go back on the road in June, and apart from anything else, driver trainers need time to get drivers prepared for the test, as no training has been going on either in the motorcycle industry or the car industry for over 10 weeks now. Even drivers who are part way through their training will need a sort of refresher at least. The DIA say that 3 weeks notice is required before driver trainers can start booking tests. So the DIA want more information. The DIA aren't the only people who are following this up. The various other rider groups are also involved. For example, the Motorcycle Action Group have also been tackling this. So that I'm myself not directly affected by the lack of driving tests for obvious reasons, because I focus on post-test training. But it would be nice to have some guidance to work with. I've done my best with sort of generalized guidance from the government, and that's why I have relaunched my courses. But I do feel very much for all my colleagues out there who run basic training schools, who are really quite stuffed at the moment, waiting for something to happen. Right, okay, so just a reminder, you are watching Elevenses with Kevin Williams, and a reminder that from this week there will be 2 shows weekly, Wednesdays and Sundays at 11, and you will be able to catch up on Facebook, here on YouTube, and also on my Coffee channel, which I will give you a link to later. So hopefully see you on the revised schedule. Hope you don't miss the shows too much. Okay, so what else? Rider groups here and abroad, you probably noticed, are happily promoting the use of motorcycles, and they're doing that, making statements to the effect that commuters can obviously avoid travelling in public transport, crowded trains, buses, tubes, at a time when there's a significant risk from COVID-19, and that motorcycles are safer because they allow for better social distancing. Fairly obviously, when you're riding a bike, you are pretty much on your own. They've also argued the usual old things, that motorcycles are congestion busting, and that would definitely be a benefit if it stopped people switching away from public transport to cars in big cities. The usual thing about motorcycles being more economical and greener. Well, I debunked that one on regular occasions. I'm not convinced by that one at all. But what happens when we all switch to bikes? Now, this is an example of a statement that came out of Australia, just to show you that this is not simply the UK talking about this. There are 2 million license holders apparently in Australia, and around 900,000 motorcycles actually on the road. And the writer drew the conclusion that that would mean that there's something like 1.1 million motorcyclists who have a license but don't actually ride a motorcycle. It's probably not quite as simple as that. A lot of people like me will probably have more than one bike. But anyway, brushing that aside, that's a fairly significant number of people who could, in theory, just jump on a motorcycle and use it to get to work. And of course, the pro biking groups are saying that would be a very good thing, not just for biking generally, but for the environment and the industry, as well as being a public health benefit. Now, I don't have the UK figures to give you off the top of my head, but I remember that there are something like 1.2 million active motorcyclists in the UK. And again, if I remember right, it's something like twice that number who hold a motorcycle license but don't actively ride. Now, just imagine that some of that number, that 2 million or so, switched to riding bikes. Now, add in some of those 1.2 million riders who actually do have a bike already, they do ride but don't commute. And then add in another figure. People who are new to motorcycling, who don't currently have a license, but go out there, either get a CBT or when they get the opportunity, they get their full license and they start using a motorcycle to commute. Now, we could be looking at a pretty considerable number. We could possibly double the number of people commuting to work on motorcycles. Now, that sounds great in some ways, doesn't it? But there's one thing that nobody seems to have thought about. For all the jam busting potential of using motorcycles over cars to commute, where are people going to park when they get there? Motorcycle will be of absolutely zero use unless there is somewhere near where people work where they can leave that motorcycle during the day. Now, if you've ever tried parking in central London, you'll know that existing bays are overwhelmed. They're full of commuter scooters and motorcycles from quite early in the morning. And if you do want a slot during the day, you're out of luck. Several times I've tried to ride into London and park, and I basically ended up riding around for quite a long time trying to find an empty hole in an overcrowded parking bay. And it's not just London. I've done exactly the same in Oxford. I spent 40 minutes not that long ago cruising around central Oxford trying to find a parking bay. I eventually got directed to two by a traffic warden. Of course, they were both completely full to the brim. And all I was trying to do was nip into Oxford for 5 minutes and out again. And the days when you could generally park on a quiet piece of pavement in a corner, they're pretty much over. You'll generally get a ticket before you can even blink if you try that. So if rider groups and their industry buddies are all hoping to get a significant growth in motorcycle usage, then the implication is clear. Many riders are going to find that parking difficult, if not impossible. Now, have I seen suggestions from any of these groups that they're engaging with local councils or even national government on this issue? Well, the answer to that is no, I haven't. Now, it doesn't mean that it's not being raised behind the scenes. One possibility that occurred to me is that they're simply keeping quiet on the parking issue so as not to put people off buying bikes right at this very moment when the industry is severely depressed. I kind of will face that hurdle when we come to it. But if it hasn't been talked about, it really does need to be addressed sooner rather than later, because the log jam of bikes trying to park will only get worse as people start filtering back to work. And that leads me into another issue. Once you've arrived at your parking bay, what are the risks? Has anybody offered any guidance to riders on how they should keep themselves as safe as they possibly can after they've completed their commuting journey? Well, it's another area where I've seen no advice offered. The exception, oddly enough, comes from a website in the Philippines. Now, you probably know that motorcycles are a hugely important form of transport out there. So it's perhaps not surprising that that's where I found the only useful information I've come across. The writer on the site said that security personnel are forever preoccupied with checking the body temperature of mall visitors, spraying sanitizers on their hands, reminding people to observe health protocols, but very little attention is given to the parking area for two-wheelers. And he went on to say that if riders aren't reminded of health practices when parking their bikes, this could mean trouble later on, considering that motorcycles are left with a very small parking space when parking inside malls. Now, there's nothing different there about most of the parking areas that you find in London, except possibly many more of them are outdoors. Anyway, they talked to a local doctor, and he said that the social distancing is important when it comes to non-living things, but it is for people. But he did actually say that that there is a need to maintain social distancing and contagion control, and to do things like regularly disinfect helmets, gloves, and any surfaces that might get touched on the bike itself. So what he basically said was, when you're getting off your bike, try not to gather too close to other riders. And he said, remember, it's the people that are the carriers, not the inanimate objects. But he's also said you do need to observe strict hand hygiene when you touch any surfaces. So he said, don't put your helmet on flat surfaces where the virus could have been deposited. So that could be, for example, if the bike's been parked and you come back to it, don't plonk your helmet on the fuel tank or the seat, because there's a chance that you could pick up the virus on your helmet. If there's another rider gearing up, he says, wait, observe a safe distance, and then get to your bike after they've left. And then finally, he said, spare a little time to sanitize your motorcycle before you throw a leg over it, and pay particular attention to touch points. And he listed handlebar tank, the switch gear, the seat, top box if you've got one, and mirrors. And he said, make it a regular routine to sanitize those areas. So there's some interesting thinking. Right, okay. Don't forget, if you are enjoying the show, you are watching Elevenses with Kevin Williams of Survival Skills, you can pop over to my Ko-fi page, and you will not only be able to make a small donation to support me over there, but that donation is not simply money in the bank for me. It actually opens up a lot of access to better riding articles for you. There are already well over 100 articles from my back catalogue from Facebook up online, and if you become a subscriber and make a monthly subscription, then you also get access to the growing number of articles which will basically grow to form my Performance Bends course. Okay, so that's something you can do. Now, I said that I give you a video link earlier on, and I mentioned it's the best 10 minutes of your time that you can spend today. The first part of the video is the tyres that I talked about and other cheats that the manufacturers perform when they're selling a new bike. That alone is worth watching. But the final bit was also very interesting, because you may remember I talked about the need to understand thrust curves a couple of days ago. Thrust is what you feel at the back wheel. It's essentially the torque that the engine produces, moderated through the throttle and through the gears. So torque and horsepower, they're interlinked mathematically, and you'll see how on this particular video. But the key point really is that we get hung up on numbers, torque and horsepower, and really it's not the numbers that matter so much, it's the shape of the curve and specifically the gearing. Now, I managed to get a ride on a new, it was a 2019 model NC 750X when I was out in California back in February. And I noted that that bike was actually, I felt, a significant upgrade from the previous 700 model, which I rode when it first came out. But when I was talking about it and saying that how much I enjoyed it and that I felt it had become a much more practical bike, somebody immediately, of course, jumped up to it's too slow and it's too boring. Well, you know, what makes for a boring motorcycle? That's a very, very good question. Now, the NC puts out something in the order of 50 odd horsepower claimed. What it's got at the back wheel is anybody's guess. You need a dyno to find that out. But, you know, too slow. Well, what's too slow? Top speed. It's all a bit academic. Once you get much over three figures, you know, you're basically about to throw your license away. So I'm, and the other question that I always ask people who start talking about bikes that are too slow is, how fast can you get round a 60 mile per hour bend? The answer is obvious. It's 60 miles an hour. It doesn't matter whether you're on a 125 or a 1000cc superbike. You know, the superbike may handle a bit better than the CG 125, but ultimately, you know, it's the physics of the corner that constrain your speed, not the performance of the motorcycle. Clearly, the superbike will get out of the corner a bit quicker, but ultimately, you know, there is a limit to what you can use realistically on the road. And if you are on a twisty mountain road with lots of bends and loops and swoops, then the power only really comes into its own when you're accelerating between the corners. And if those corners are really close together, then there's not much chance to use the power of the bike in the first place. And then it really becomes a matter of just getting around the corners. Now, how much power do you need? Do you need a lot of horsepower for rapid acceleration? Well, the answer is no, not really. Acceleration is limited by keeping the front wheel on the ground. If you pull a wheelie, you cannot accelerate any harder or you will loop a bike. If you've ever ridden one of the old two-strokes, RD250, something like that, you'll know that they wheelied at the drop of a hat. The RD250LC was an absolute hooligan motorcycle, and that produced about 30 horsepower. 30 horsepower, that's all. A lot of people wouldn't get out of bed today for a 30 horsepower motorcycle, but they were an absolute hoot to ride. Okay, it didn't get much over 100 miles an hour, but as I said, it was the way they got there. And the way they got there was the gearing. It's the gears that matter. Whilst the RD250 was, as I say, top speed of about 100 miles an hour, it used all 6 gears to get there. And first gear was low enough that you could wheelie the thing straight off the throttle without any problem at all. Now, watch the video that I've given you the link to, and you'll see that the presenter there is making the same sort of statement I was making the other day. He doesn't actually mention thrust curves, but in essence, he's talking about the gears and throttle position, and that's what I was on about. The one thing that he does mention, which is, again, something I've talked about a lot in the past, but possibly not on this show, is a flat torque curve. If you have a flat torque curve, it means pretty much wherever you open the throttle, the bike will pull. If you've got a torque curve with a big bump in it, then anywhere where you're away from that bump, that engine will be reluctant to go. And one of the common factors of performance motorcycles with high power output is they nearly always have a matching bump in the torque curve, because there is a mathematical relationship between torque and revs. The video explains that. It'll probably do your head in. We're trying to follow the formulas, but the explanation that goes with them is relatively easy to follow. So go and spend 10 minutes when you've watched this, watching that. And when you've done that, rock up to watch MotoGP. Right, okay, that's it for today. Don't forget, it's Wednesday's the next show, and Sunday will be the next one after that. I'm also back on the road training next week. I have my first course booked on Wednesday, if I'm ever managed to get my insurance sorted out. More on that on Wednesday, I think. But anyway, thank you for watching, and hopefully catch up with you again on the next show. Bye for now.